Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to this event, Small Business Question Time, which is sponsored by the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed and SME for Labour. If any of you do want to tweet, there is a hashtag. There's always a hashtag for everything. It's hashtag smallbiz with a ZQT. So do get lots of comments going. We're waiting for John McDonnell. I'm here, he's on his way, but I think we'll just get going because we have been slightly delayed. So I'm delighted to be joined by an illustrious panel of experts from across the sort of labour movement who's going to sort of give us their views on things. We have Alison McGovern, who is one of our most senior backbenchers. She's held a variety of shadow front bench posts, and she also has led a lot of campaigns and is very, very business focused, particularly in her South Wirral constituency. We have Adam Payne at the end, who's a political reporter for Business Insider, which is one of the UK's best and most important business magazines. Oh, and he's also just been put on this very important 30 Under 30 Media Award list.
Congratulations. That was interesting.
So you're very clever and you're very youthful as well, so I'm very jealous of that. And finally we have Simon McVicker, who is not on the 30 Under 30, but he's still a fabulous person. Would be the 60 over 60.
No. I used to like you.
Simon, we're delighted to have Simon. He's the Director of Policy at the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed. He's a real expert, more than 25 years experience in the fields of policy and public affairs. And just as a starting point, you know, business is so important to the political debate at the moment, and I think one of the things that you will be frustrated about, and I get frustrated about, is when people talk about business, they immediately go to the CDI and talk about big business. Yeah. But we all know that it is SMEs who are the lifeblood of the British economy, represent over 99% of all private sector businesses, employ nearly 14.5 million people, and also represent an incredibly rich mix of different types of businesses. There's a real kind of diversity in our SME sector. So I think it's absolutely brilliant timing to be having this question time, especially with the big B word looming upon us as well. So we're going to get cracking, and the first question, we're doing this, we have sort of some questions. So the first question is from Alexi Ozioro. Alexi, where are you? Ah, lovely.
So you said 14.5 million. My research actually says 16 million.
Oh,
people.
right. Well, I'm happy to be corrected.
But my question was...
Do you want to stand up and have a...
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So, Lexi Osher here from the Building Engineering Services Association and a Labour Party member. My question is that SMEs consistently suffer late payment, withheld payment or non-payment for goods and services, with 16 million employed or solely running SMEs and voting generally Conservative. How can the Labour Party convince SMEs to vote for them, and what is a actual policy to tackle late payment?
Great question. I mean, late payments is the scourge of not just small businesses, freelancers as well. As a freelance journalist, it's the bane of my life. Alison, do you want to start with that?
Yes, I will do. So everybody's already said about how important small business is, so I won't repeat that. But I do want to say that we have been trying to tackle this problem with late payments for quite some time now. When I was first elected in 2010, can everybody hear me? At the back, Radwan, can you hear me okay? Excellent, cracking. It's always good when you've been going to Labour Party conference long enough that you can pick out people in the audience who you know, because you're a sad person whose friends all come to Labour Party conference. Isn't that right, Pete? So Debbie Abrahams, when I was first elected, had a real go at this late payments issue, and she created this charter for late payments, and the Tories kind of got wind of it, and they were trying to maybe do a little bit on it. But I really think we've been thinking about the challenge of late payments a little bit the wrong way, in that we have been trying to persuade and cajole businesses and government to pay people in a timely fashion. Whereas what I think we ought to do is work out how we can use transparency to demonstrate which companies are engaging in this practice of basically managing their cash flow by paying late their contractors. And I've been, in my role as a member of the Treasury Select Committee, I get to talk to big banks all the time, as you can imagine. And something that they're very keen to demonstrate is that it's not just startups that are using new technology to make the information that we get through our banking systems more transparent. So I think a very important challenge for the government in the future is to say, how can we manage the banking system so that we use the data that it holds to improve our economic system? Because the more we understand about how our economy works, the more we can change it and set the rules up. So what I would like to do is to use banking technology to work out who the worst offenders are, and to create a system of incentives, and like we have with the gender pay gap and the Women in Finance Charter, use the data that we have and that we can acquire and that we can force companies to reveal, to take the burden off of small businesses and self-employed people, and to make the government say, okay, these are the standards that we expect. We will use the banking data that we have to work out who is paying late, and to shine a light on it in that way. And I think that we need to start again with how we think about this problem of late payments, because whilst the efforts that Debbie kicked off and then our Labour front bench adopted in having a charter that businesses would sign up to was a good thing, I'd be interested in people's views in this room, but we've been working on this for 5 years at least now, and I don't think it's worked. So I think we have to start from a slightly different principle and say, is there a way of getting independent data on this issue and then show where the problems are and require that those businesses deal with it?
And also, would you envisage a system where people get named and shamed publicly?
Well, we've been doing some of that on national minimum wage enforcement, and I've had companies in my constituency who were in breach of the rules and who were named and shamed, and they didn't like it, and I went to see them to talk about it, and actually I think it's been a healthy cultural change, because whilst it's not always comfortable for companies to be in that position, I do think knowing that is a potential consequence is quite an important an important factor, and this is where I think transparency can be a really important tool in the box. I daren't talk about MPs' expenses really, because it was such a wasp's nest at the time. But I don't think anyone would argue that the transparency that we have over that system now has done anything but good.
Yeah.
That was a really bad and difficult situation to get out of. We've inserted some transparency, and it's been positive. So I think we should go down that road.
Well, as someone once said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Often, isn't it? Simon, your take on this question?
Well, as far as we're concerned, the self-employed and the one-person businesses, it's not just late payment, it's no payment is a big problem, and we've done some research around this, and we found that 43% of freelancers have completed work that they never got paid for. But amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, that goes up to 58%. And indeed, it is very prevalent in the creative industries.
Yeah.
Now, on average, freelancers lose something like £5,300 a year by working without payment, because they feel so weak and not empowered to do anything that they just do not pursue it. So we were very supportive of the setting up the Small Business Commissioner, because we felt that there was going to be a mechanism there for people to go summon to take up their case. But what we were talking about was the Australian Small Business Commissioner, which was the best practice internationally to look at. And in Australia, set up by a Labour government in New South Wales, by the way, they're able to name and shame, but they have legislative powers to fine people as well. And it's been very successful in Australia. But here, our Small Business Commissioner has very few powers. He is able to name and shame, but he's not doing so. And he's meant to be writing a report to Parliament illustrating who the bad people are. He will say that his problem is no one is brave enough to bring their cases to him. So maybe it's a wee bit of both. But I do think that one thing I would ask the Labour government to do is to strengthen the Small Business Commissioner and give it the powers that it had in Australia when the Australian, I think it was the New South Wales government, set it up. I mean, we are all for fining late payers, and also the making compulsory prompt payment code as well. And also the other thing we were talking about earlier with the co-ops, we want to promote cooperatives and sort of help people, self-employed people, come together and pool money and get help in a cooperative way. So that would be our solution to this.
Excellent. Well, I think some of your statistics are really arresting about freelancers. I once did a piece of work for a newspaper, and it took so long for me to get paid that the newspaper actually closed down.
Wow, that is a problem.
That is quite
Yeah.
something. That is quite something. Adam, what's your take on it from a sort of journalistic point of view?
Well, firstly, I'd just like to thank you for having me here. It's always very flattering to do things like this, but I guess it's extra special for me because I actually lived and studied in Liverpool for 3 years, so it's like a weird full circle moment. But anyway, back to the actual issue. I did some reading on this issue, obviously, before I did this, and there are some pretty alarming statistics. On average, SMEs are owed £63,000 from late payments. 11% of SMEs are owed 100 grand or more, and 58% of SMEs earlier this summer said that they feel this issue threatens the future, their own future. So what I take away from that, not only is this terrible and a bit of a scandal, it's really not sustainable. I'm not elected, so I'm not here to create policy, but I think I'd agree with what's been said previously, that transparency and making it more, SMEs getting hold of data which can help them make decisions like, what companies have got a bad track record of late payments. Some SMEs don't carry out credit checks, for example. Ultimately, to me, and this doesn't just apply to this particular question, but perhaps across the whole political spectrum, if you act and behave in an ethical and fair and honest way, you should welcome transparency, not try and fight against it. So on the question of policies, I think a Labour government, which might be sooner rather than later, should look at strengthening the powers of the Commissioner, as Simon said, and make it easy for SMEs, help SMEs get hold of, as I said, data where they can track the behaviour of customers. They can, carry out credit checks like that. I guess what I would say is that the Conservative Party has long sold itself as the party of business, but they've got a really funny way of showing it when you look at things like this. But other things we'll talk about, like universal credit, etc.
And Adam, do you think, if there was more transparency and businesses were being, named and shamed, do you think you as a business journalist, would that be a story you would write? Would businesses risk a hit to their reputation, in terms of these figures became public?
I imagine lots of SMEs wouldn't like it, but if you behaved in a proper way, then it's not an issue, is it? I think if we
No,
have
I kind of more put it in terms of be helpful for people in the sense that they could be, you would shame them probably. In the
as
press.
a journalist?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's definitely in the public interest
Yeah.
to do so. Yeah, I think there's a really strong public interest argument there. I mean, just for clarification, I'm a political reporter, so I write about this type of thing not as much as my colleagues do, but this is something I'm really interested in. And is there a public interest defence for naming and shaming companies which aren't acting fairly? I'd say absolutely, unequivocally so. I think there is.
Yeah. Alexia, just come back to you. Do you want to reflect on the answers that you've heard? Is there anything you'd like to sort of add to what you've heard?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the answers. There is already in existence a prompt payment code that's not worth the paper it's written on. Carillion was on that code.
Right. That's exactly my point.
So, I love what the panel is saying about strengthening the power of the Small Business Commissioner.
Yeah.
I actually had a chat with him a while ago, and he said that he wants to be able to walk into a room and you're shaking in your boots because he can levy a fine against you. If that were the case, and there were actually some consequences and some results from abusing your supply chain, I think less people would do it. So, you know, transparency is wonderful, naming and shaming is wonderful. Naming and shaming has been shown not to work so far.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that question. We're now going to go to Leary Amadetti.
Yes.
Yes, you're at the back. We'll pass the.
Hi. I would just like to ask, what would a future Labour government do about the gig economy?
Great question, because of course the gig economy is now a huge and important, growing, but very insecure part of our kind of economy and workforce. Simon, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Very vexed question. The first thing I want to point out is that the gig economy is often confused with self-employment, and yes, many people in the gig economy are self-employed, but it is only 8% of self-employment, and I think when we talk about self-employment issues, we must try and just separate the two things. We ourselves at IPSA believe in a statutory definition of self-employment, and we believe that, I mean, we give a report into the Taylor Review, where we created a matrix to help define what self-employment is, and we fed this into the government as well, because we believe that until you get an understanding of what self-employment is and the policymakers lay it out in legislation, then you're going to have all this other confusion about what self-employment is. Now, the gig economy, some people in the gig economy are definitely self-employed. And you have to forget about Uber and all these delivery types. There are a lot of other people in the gig economy who are genuinely self-employed. There are obviously a few who are in a very grey area, and that's what all the policy talk has been about. Taylor is talking about dependent contractors, making them into this workers category where they will get holiday rights. Is it sick pay rights? Is that right? Yeah. You know, and I'm not against that. But what I'm against is that if you have a catch-all solution, you may drag in genuine self-employed people into this new category, and I think that would be a shame, because you know, self-employment is contributing so much to the UK economy. I think last year it was something like £270 billion, and I think we've got to be very careful we don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Sure, there are problems and there are vulnerable people out there, and we all want to deal with that, but we must get the policy right. And the other thing is, there was a report done by the Centre for Research and Self-Employment, which looked at self-employment, and it said that there's no one definition of self-employment really. They identify 9 different types of self-employment. So when you come to make policy around self-employment, you must bear in mind that you cannot do a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's what makes it so complex and so controversial. But I do believe we cannot leave it to the courts to decide what self-employment is. I mean, it depends who your judge is on the day. You have to have money to go to the courts, so you get very weird cases, like the Pimlico Plumbers case, which is a rich businessman trying to prove his workforce is self-employment when they were not, so obviously not. So, you know, it is time for policymakers to step up here and working with experts, define it in law, I think. But I know that's quite a difficult thing to do, and I know it's quite controversial, but until I think we do that, all these other problems are going to continue.
Alison, what's your sort of take on this? I mean, Simon has said that you can't have a one-size-fits-all, and you know, and you didn't really focus on the Ubers. And where do you get this? How does the diversity of the gig economy work for you as a Labour politician?
So, you know how Sadiq Khan's got a thing where he always says, my dad was a bus driver.
Yeah.
Right. So my equivalent of that is my granddad was a folk singer.
Ah.
So my granddad was a folk singer, and as we're in Liverpool, I am very proud that he wrote the song In My Liverpool Home.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So my granddad wrote In My Liverpool Home, and he wrote it when he was in his 40s, and he was a serving railway engineer at the time. And the reason why I mention it is because people do always forget this slight complexity in that we call it the gig economy because, like, musicians were the first ones, right? You know, musicians have traditionally had a job and then they gigged on the side to make a bit more money. That's why my granddad learned to play guitar so that he could go gigging. And he was trying to supplement his income. He came from a very, very poor background and he'd learned to play the guitar so that he could do that. And I think that we have to separate out people who are genuinely in the gig economy, which is about having an extra skill or a talent, just, you know, creating a kind of income for yourself that is very, very different from either full-time, ordinary employment, you know, or even part-time employment, but kind of regular employment as we would understand it. What's going on with some other companies is that they are trying to escape their responsibilities as an employer. And I tend to agree with Simon here, actually. That's why probably Parliament should define some of these terms a little bit better. That's why we probably need, I mean, I think the Taylor Review is a good start, but I think it's very insufficient because I think it will, if anything, confuse the situation. I think the idea of a dependent contractor is quite a confusing piece of terminology. I think we should get clear what people's rights are as an employee and their responsibilities as an employer, and make sure that that by and large characterises the vast majority of work in this country. There will always be a place for the gig economy. There will always be people like Peter John McGovern who pick up a guitar suddenly, and then he wrote that song and it just took off. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very much in favour of copyright being protected, because that song meant we could go on holiday for years. So that genuine bit of the gig economy where people are doing something creative and it is actually outside their normal employment, I think should always be protected. And I'll just say one final thing on this, which is that if you look at the Taylor Review and the report that came out of it, there is a glaring omission that every person who's a Labour member will see immediately when you read that work. And it is two words: trade and unions. Because actually what we've had in this country over the past sort of 3 decades, when Labour were in power, the membership of trade unions increased a little bit and sort of stabilised. But what happened was that there was a radical fall in the membership of trade unions in the 1980s, and when the austerity cuts hit in 2011, all of these mainly women public sector workers lost their jobs, and that caused another big dip in the membership of trade unions. We know young people aren't joining trade unions, and so there needs to be a radical mission for all of us in this movement, wherever we sit in it, to increase the membership of trade unions. I think there's some really practical things that we can do on that, whether it's paying your trade union subs out of your pre-tax income, or a whole variety of enabling organisation through digital formats and other things. But it needs to start with an ideological shift, because for too long we have treated trade unions like special interest groups over there. They're like membership organisations where we say, oh, of course you want that trade union, that's just the interest of your members. But I wouldn't dream of telling a I wouldn't dream of telling a faith-based organisation, atheist though I am, well, your demands are of no interest to me because I'm not one of your members. Because I think they're part of civil society and should be listened to, whatever perspective you have. Trade unions have to be seen like that. Whether you're a member of a trade union or not, their presence in democratising our workplaces and making our economy better for working people is valid for all of us, and we have to collectively act to improve their position in our economy.
Adam, your take on the gig. What should a future Labour government do about the gig economy?
Well, my answer might be quite short, because I broadly agree with what's been just said. But what I will say is the gig economy debate I feel is much more nuanced and complex than perhaps some of where some people speak about it suggests. I think you're right, like there are some terms which need clarifying in the gig economy. We need more fixed categories. Simon, you mentioned the Gary Smith versus Pimlico Plumbers case. I think that was an important case because it was incredibly newsworthy. It put this issue like on the map, I guess. But I think what also you correctly said was that this case had a very unique context. It had very unique facts related to it. And what I will say is that what would I encourage a Labour government to do is to just take its time over this. There seems to be really trendy to try and come up with like overnight fixes to fiendishly complex jobs. But when you look at universal credit and things like that, which we'll come on to later, I guess, which has been a monumental disaster, I would encourage the Labour government to take its time over this, to spend the time researching it, because I almost feel like the term gig economy is unhelpful because it brings everything together into quite a simple shorthand. So my advice to a Labour government would be to take its time over it, because it is one of the major problems, and I honestly don't think we know properly how to deal with it yet, and to acquire that knowledge and to apply it in an effective way will take time.
Okay, Adam, thank you very much. And then we're delighted to be joined by John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor. John, what would a future Labour government do about the gig economy?
Let me tell you what. Is this working? I don't know. Let me tell you what we've been doing over the last 18 months anyway. Before the last general election, we set up a working group with the Federation of Small Businesses to look at a number of issues. Included in that working group were front bench members, but also representatives from individual trade unions, including Equity, Musicians Union, you name them, all those ones that are involved in the range of applications for gig economy, as well as the larger unions too. Also included in that group were representatives from the Institute of Employment Rights and John Hendy QC in particular. So the work that has been done is to secure a clearer definition of self-employment, and that's as strong a wish as the Federation of Small Businesses has asked. So therefore we can actually identify a much clearer legal definition of worker and self-employed, and then tackle the issue, and this is the big issue for the FSB, which is bogus self-employment, and the way that's been developed. That's the first thing. The second thing, I absolutely concur, the failure of the Taylor report was to fail to recognise the collective nature of this issue, and therefore the role of trade unions, and that's why at the TUC a couple of weeks ago we were setting out some trade union positions, both in terms of the extension of trade union rights from employment from day one and the protections that will bring. So the ongoing work is around that. The discussions that are taking place now is how we bring that forward into commitments in the future manifesto.
What do you say to some people that say, look, some people like being part of the gig economy, some people very much like flexible working, some people like 0 hours contracts, students, this, that thing. What's your kind of comeback to that?
Our view is that workers should be protected. They should have a level of guaranteed hours, and that enables them. That enables them to have the security against the exploitation that takes place at the moment. There'll always be elements of flexibility. There always will be, but I just think we have to wake up to the reality of what's going on. If you look at what's happened with the representations from IWGB and others about Uber, Deliveroo, etc.
University of London.
It's just outrageous. And it's a balance of judgment on all these things, but we can't continue in a society in which there's such levels of low pay, exploitation and abuse.
Yeah. And how do you, in terms of trying to get more, I think you and Alison all agreed about the growing role of the trade union, how do you get big companies, your McDonnell's, that type of thing, how do you get them to allow trade unions to come into their workforce?
5 years ago I went to the Bakers Union and asked them would they take up the issue of the fast food campaign as developed in America. Bakers Union is a small union, not particularly well resourced, but not bad. But they represent the Greggs workers anyway on the high street. So So the Bakers Union over that period now have been mobilising to recruit within McDonald's. And it's tough. It's really tough. And it's the recruitment has been done by the union. But actually, alongside that, there's an element of sort of civil society or social movement activity too in support of those workers who are incredibly vulnerable. And what's happened is that you're seeing the sort of creeping recruitment of McDonald's workers into the union. And you're seeing the first industrial action that's taking place within McDonald's workers. And it's interesting that that's then spread out to others. So Wetherspoons now, TGI Fridays, and they're largely young workers, at times particularly vulnerable. But again, I think we're getting to the stage where there may well be a critical mass, as happened in the States, and then the employment.
That's a tipping point at which.
And I've involved myself in the campaign. On every occasion when there is a dispute, I've contacted management to see if we can engage in a dialogue and discussion. So far that hasn't produced the ability of them to recognise it. But it's happening, it will come.
Yeah.
There's a global campaign on McDonald's, for example. Every year we have at least one global day of action, where action will take place in Australia and then move on right the way around to every country on the globe where McDonald's is present in those things. And that sort of pressure is beginning to build, and I think the issue there is about reputational damage. You don't want to be in that situation. You shouldn't be into this confrontational position.
No, it's.
But it is some of the companies. I think some of the companies themselves begin to understand that actually people aren't willing to put up with those pressures.
Yeah, absolutely. Leary, are you happy with those answers that you've had? Is there anything else you would like to add in terms of reflecting your thoughts?
No, everything was really, really illuminating. Thank you. I particularly like the aspects of workers getting a particular right that they need. So this woman says that we can't hear too much, so if you just speak up a bit.
Oh, right. Can everybody just go a bit closer to their microphones? Okay, sorry about that. Right, we are going to crack on now. Mark Glover. Mark, can stand up and...
Mic?
You might have to project.
That's okay, I'll do my best.
Oh, hang on. Is there a mic coming? There's a mic coming.
Hi, I'm Mark Glover. I'm Chief Executive of Newington Communications, which is Southwark's SME Business of the Year at the moment.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. The plug there. I just want to say, Brexit's a huge impact. When everyone talks about Brexit, impact on the economy, the biggest group that can be impacted is going to be SMEs, particularly those involved in the import and export market. What is Labour going to do to support SMEs in dealing with Brexit? And I'm nervous about that we will negotiate a better deal. It's a simple answer. So I'd really like to hear from Labour what they think would be the best solution to help SME businesses deal with the incoming Brexit.
Okay, the B word. Yep. John, I think we'll come straight to you on this. That's all right.
In our position, the best thing can help them is an agreement which actually has a customs union, and maintain the existence of a customs union in some form, and we get the relationship with the single market. Will the government deliver that? No, they won't. They will. And I think it's a god-awful mess that we're going into. You've seen with the debate today that in terms of our position, which was, if we can't get a general election, we'll go for a people's vote of some sort. Will that be on the deal or will it remain? Has to be open. I would have thought all the options still on the table. It's a god-awful mess. It really is. And you get to the point, you get to the point in the House of Commons where you virtually despair. Because literally, it's not just you. In my constituency, I've got large and small businesses. I've got Heathrow. What the hell is happening on aviation? Because they keep reassuring me, don't worry, the airplanes will be flying, will they? I don't know. It's a god-awful mess. We don't know from day to day which particular faction in cabinet is in control, who's leading on effectively on the negotiations. My view, Barnier and others will offer some form of deal to Theresa May to bring back, just because if they don't, they're worried about Johnson taking over. So she'll come back with something that she won't be able to get through Parliament, almost certainly, or she won't be able to get it through the Tory party before it's presented to Parliament. And it's a mess. It's a mess. I just want to get rid of them. Because in any form, the Tories cannot negotiate any form of deal that will satisfy the protection of jobs or the economy. Simple as that. And you just want to despair at times at the state that they've got themselves into. And in normal on stuff like this, when there's such an issue that goes beyond party interests. This is a huge issue for the country. Often you can get a dialogue going with the other political parties to enable something to happen or to move on. We don't even know who to have that dialogue with. Literally, you do not know what factions in control. If we were there now, yes, whatever the debate happens today, if we were there now, we would have been negotiating for 18 months on the customs union, access to the single market. We would, I think, the spirit, the nature of the negotiations would have been transformed overnight. And I keep saying to people, in my previous job as chief executive of local government, I managed European funds. I managed them for London overall. I had an office in Brussels. We had a London house. What you don't do, you don't negotiate by banging the table, threatening to walk out. You negotiate on the basis of mutual interest and mutual respect, and that's the sort of atmosphere that we would create. And in fact, in the discussions that we have with our European partners, that is the relationship that we have. And we think there's a deal willing to be done, which actually I think will bring our country back together again and give us a relationship with Europe for the future. But this isn't going to happen under this government. In the meantime, if they do fall apart, we'll do everything we possibly can to press the government for certain protections. But if you talk to the Engineering Employers Federation, they've calculated, I can't remember the exact figures, but they've calculated sort of a 3-minute delay in processing at Dover is another 3 or 4 kilometres on the queue from Dover to London. It's just staggering. I was trying to wake the government up to the implications of this. And I think at some stage in November, Theresa May's got to admit that she's not going to be able to deliver anything, and that's why I want her to go. I'm sorry, that's a message of despair, but I'm so bloody angry about it. I don't know what to say.
And just as a quick follow-up, John, do you feel, I mean, would the Labour Party be in a position to itself take a team to Brussels and say that,
We are already.
you know, here's something that we made earlier? And
Well, Keir and Jeremy and others have been on a regular dialogue with our European partners. They know where we stand. They know the situation we're in with our own country as well. They're sympathetic to our positioning, and so the relationship is there. So yeah, you know, we've got a competent team. And you know,
so you're confident that
compare Keir Starmer to Brexit negotiators that we've had already, a succession of David Davis and Dominic Raab.
There's no contest. My favourite Dominic Raab moment was someone in the select committee, they said to him, have you been to Northern Ireland? He went, yep, I've been to Dublin. Next. You're like, yeah, okay, this is where the problem is. Okay, thank you. Alison, to you next. How can Labour make Brexit work for small business?
Okay, well, I'm going to come to small business specifically in a minute, but I just want to say, having heard what John has just said, and I think he's absolutely correct, I think that, you know, Barry Gardner sort of made this probably unwise comment that on Brexit, you know, we shouldn't be interrupting our enemy whilst they're making a mistake. And I think everybody, having heard what John has said, would appreciate why that's actually wrong. And I think the point is we're going to try and interrupt them and hopefully replace them every step of the way. Because actually what Labour Party conference, hopefully in approximately, I'm not sure what time we are now, in about 10 minutes, hopefully Labour Party conference is going to agree our position. And I think, you know, for those who are not compositing watchers and haven't been following every twist and turn of the compositing process, I think what you might spot in the motion is that it says we need a relationship that guarantees full participation in the single market. And I think for all of those SMEs out there that are worrying about the kind of detailed rules, regulations, systems within which their business works, whether it's data, legal services, insurance, a plethora, creative industries, we never ever seem to talk about creative industries. There's a plethora of small businesses out there for whom we need to keep it simple, and I think full participation in the single market and the Labour Party advocating for that as a backstop is a really crucial principle, and I'm very, very pleased. You know, this time last year we were in a different place, but I'm very pleased that we've got there now. Another reason why the composite is absolutely excellent, I think, is that it gives us that backstop position, given the chaos that John has just really accurately outlined. It gives us that backstop position of saying this may need to go back to the public, and we may need, given all of the chaos that we've seen, to say to people, is it worth it, and make sure that Remain is on the ballot paper. And I think if people were in the conference hall for the response to Keir's speech earlier, you know, you've got to be honest. The view of the Labour membership is clear, and I think there's a lot of people within the Labour Party who understand the world of SMEs, who are themselves freelancers or whatever else, who are worried about this new economy, but also inspired by some of the possibilities that it offers, and I think want that principle of internationalism that the Labour Party offers. And as I say, the response from conference to what Keir was putting forward to them was clear. At the risk of overly demonstrating the unity, I couldn't agree with John more. Keir's leadership on this, I think, has been first rate. But also the trade unions, I think, have been crucial in getting us to this really good position. The final thing I would say on SMEs in relation to Brexit is it is definitely the case that their voice is not being heard. I feel that from the point of view of Treasury Select Committee. I think that we hear quite a lot from big business, and of course, if the CEO of Jaguar Land Rover gives an interview to the FT, that's going to make the front page. But I think we've got to be creative in how SMEs have their collective voice heard. So my door is open, and I am looking for ideas on how do we get the collective voice of all our SMEs, freelancers, and those in the gig economy heard on the danger that Brexit poses to them.
Thank you, Alison. You're right about the creative industries. I do a bit of work with the music industry, and they've already lost a huge amount of money in terms of the fluctuation with the pound. And also lots of bands tour across Europe. If there are any delays in terms of freedom of movement, that's going to be a big problem for a lot of orchestras as well and things like that. So there's a big...
And if I may, Ayesha, this is not some corner of the economy. This is an industry in which we are the world leaders right now. And there are other countries around the world that would like to challenge our position in filmmaking, audio-visual. They would love to take some of this business. So this is not a side issue. This should be front and centre.
No, absolutely.
On Alison's point about, I fully agree with that. On Alison's point about the voice, I'm furious about the whole situation, and I think SMEs and others need to express their fury. I really do, because the supply chains across Europe, of which we're an essential part of, will break down. It will break down. I don't know many companies in my area and small firms that don't have some form of European connection. And there needs to be a fury expressed to the government about what they're doing. And if they, I just keep saying, if they can't do it, get out of the way.
No, absolutely. And also I think there's a lazy assumption that when you say business, everyone goes, oh, but it's fat cat, big business. And it's like, no, it's not, it's SMEs. Adam, your take on this very important topic is...
Yeah, on Brexit, I will preface this by saying for SMEs to have continued access to all the ingredients that help SMEs flourish. So just-in-time production, frictionless trade, continued access to talent, the list goes on. Single market customs union, or as close as you can get to those structures, is the best you can do. Moving on, I think John made the point that if Labour led these negotiations, the mood would be better, and I think you'd do well to worsen the mood at the moment. But also what I would say is that Salzburg and what happened in Salzburg didn't just raise questions about Chequers. Well, it's not a question, Chequers is dead, that's a matter of fact. But it also raised questions about Labour's position, because John in his response then said, we've got a customs union. I personally think that's a good policy, but then he said we're going to get a deal with the single market. And you can create mutual joy and have a laugh over a negotiating table, but a good laugh isn't going to convince the EU to divide its single market. At the moment, Labour's single market policy, and I'll happily be corrected if I'm wrong, is that we want as many as the benefits and privileges as possible, but we're not sure about state aid. We'd rather not have free movement of people, and like it or not, that is cherry picking. It may not be cherry picking in the most fragrant kind of outstanding way the Tories are doing it, but I've spoken to European commissioners, I've spoken to people in Brussels, and although they agree that Labour would be much nicer people to negotiate with, and they won't have people like Boris Johnson like a bull in a china shop, to me Labour's policy on the single market needs some work. And I know Labour has this policy of being ambiguous in a constructive way, and put it in an electoral context, I can totally get that. I totally get that the Labour Party has different voters to keep happy and to understand the concerns of. But given the size of Brexit and given the situation we find ourselves in, a no deal is likely than it's ever been before, time is running out. I think an issue the size of Brexit gives Labour not just a constitutional obligation, but a moral obligation to provide a more coherent and detailed alternative.
So, John, just on that point, I mean, what I'm saying is,
My moral obligation.
can you cherry pick? Can you have your cake and eat it in terms of the cherry picking the good bits, but not taking the sort of bits we don't like?
Any form of negotiation can be interpreted as cherry picking. Any form of negotiation. I think there's the potential of ensuring that we can negotiate a deal which will protect jobs and the economy. I really do. And I want the opportunity to prove that. We can't get that opportunity until this government goes.
But why do you think they would give you a preferential deal when they wouldn't give Theresa May one?
Because some of these issues that we're raising are not fundamentalist in the way that they are with Theresa May, and that within other European states as well, they're looking for potential reform in some of these areas too. So I think there's a potential for coming together.
And reforming Europe.
But again, we want the opportunity to try that. If it doesn't work, that then gives us the opportunity to go back to the British people and say this negotiation hasn't worked like that.
Adam?
I think, yeah, I'd agree with John that there is definitely an appetite in some member states to reform the free movement of people, but unless the Commission has been telling porky pies all this time, that isn't likely. And what I'm interested in, I don't want to go down a massive tangent, but the reason, for example, some people in Labour aren't keen on Norway plus customs union for that single market customs union deal is that we'd have no power. But if we were to negotiate a free trade deal, we'd also have no power. So I'm a bit confused by some of the reasonings that people give for X, Y, and Z. And I said I don't want to get down a tangent of discussing Norway model versus Canada. But as I said, although I'm sure Labour would be much friendlier, much more cooperative people to work with, but I'm still not convinced on the detail of quite key aspects of its policy.
Because it's all very deeply confusing at this stage. I think we can all agree on that. Simon, can you clear it up for us?
Well, maybe.
Sort it out.
Well, as the only person here that speaks for business, I mean, look, I represent very small businesses, but I think there's a general view across the business community that what the hell's going on? There is no coherency from the government on where it stands, what it wants. Different factions say different things. I think we're all very worried about it. As far as the smallest business is concerned, you're right, John, we rely on the supply chain. We rely on the big manufacturing companies, on the banks, etc. So if they start moving out of the UK, then our members are in big trouble. My members, they do work in Europe. They go to Dutch banks and things like that. And if they can't have that free movement, that is going to curtail their business activity quite considerably. And we would just like business to be listened to, because there's a feeling that we're not part of this debate, and yet we're crucial to the economy. And you're right, the Conservatives have stopped listening. We used to go to a round table with Mrs. May on small business issues, and we had a row, I think, over NICs, and she stopped having those meetings. So she's not getting it. She's not getting anything from us. So really, we're in despair. We're with you in that, John. Total despair. And it's so close now, and there's no plan. So.
So Mark, just coming back to you, what are your reflections on what you've heard having asked a question? By the way, Alison has to go. So
Yeah,
can we give a round?
I'm sorry, everyone.